I'm working up here and she's downstairs in the dining room. It gets interesting sometimes.
I'm sure. I think Kristen said that she was starting the live at 6:30 and it's 6:30 now.
Okay. Recording has started. Folks, do you want to wait a minute or two for stragglers, or do you want to start? It's kind of your pleasure. My time is yours.
I don't know how many were. Here's the mayor. She'll know how many people were expected, and maybe we can wait a couple of minutes.
No, I don't know how many people were expected. I know approximately how many people were invited, but not everybody replied. So the whole city council was invited. The whole Board of Health was invited. And also all the members of Community Alliance were invited. So, but not everybody responded whether they were coming. But I do agree, give it another 5 minutes and then
Okay, well, the recording is rolling, so we'll have to be careful not to say anything untoward. And I'll start talking at about 6:35. How's that?
Okay. That sounds good, Tom Hennick. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Nancy. Even virtually, it's good to see you.
Okay, I'll put myself on mute then.
Okay, it's 6:35. Why don't we get started? Nancy, I don't know if you wanted to make an introduction of any kind, or you want me to just jump right in.
Well, I'd be happy to introduce you. Tom Hennick and I go back a lot of years from when I first got on the city council back in 2005. And he's been quite a help. He has he can give you the answers to any of the Freedom of Information requests, questions, whatever you have. And that's why I wanted him to come, because I know there's been, a lot of new members and new boards set up. And I wanted to make sure that people had the right tools to be able to do things successfully. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Thomas Hennick.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks for the invite. And folks, feel free to jump in as we go along. Sometimes these sessions are better if we're interactive. And I'd also ask you if you wouldn't mind to turn your videos on. Don't be shy, so that we can interact with each other. The more people we can see, the better it would be. Obviously, if you don't want to, I can't make you, but it'd be nice if the videos were on. So we do these workshops, as Nancy mentioned. We go way back. We've done this a long time, Nancy. The idea of these sessions is not to beat you up, not to make you miserable, not to have you leave you wringing your hands. The idea is to try to help, to try to give you the tools to work with, so that freedom of information does not become a burden, does not become something that weighs you down and prevents you from doing the tasks that you've either been elected to do or appointed to do, and that you can get on with the business of West Haven. The problem, of course, is that freedom of information comes with the territory. You probably didn't run for office or asked to be appointed to a board and think, okay, and then I also have to deal with freedom of information. But it comes with the territory because it's the law in the state of Connecticut. It's a law that's 46 years old. It was Ella Grasso's brainchild when she ran for governor for the first time. And when you do the math, 46 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. And you had a country that was in turmoil, a country that was beset with all kinds of problems. And Ella Grasso was in Congress when Watergate kind of exploded all around us. And she was looking at all this, and she said, if I'm elected, if I run for governor and if I'm elected, I'm going to see to it that Connecticut has some sort of an open government law. It's important, it's imperative that our country, this example, never sort of filters down to Connecticut. So she ran and she won, as you know. And then she one of the first things she did in 1975 was put forward this concept for an open government law. And she said, it's very important, and I'm pushing this law, and I think it's so important that I will see to it that this law is approved unanimously by the legislature. Now, Mike, you said you testified today. Can you imagine guaranteeing a unanimous vote on this law, or on any vote, on any law? It's somewhat mind-boggling, but she guaranteed it. And I'm actually here to tell you that she got it. I have seen a video of the vote. There wasn't a single no vote in the House, not a single no vote in the Senate. This law passed unanimously in the Connecticut legislature. It was signed with a great flourish. Now, why do I share that? Well, I share that because it's interesting, but it also shows you how important this law was then and how important it remains today. But it also gives you a little insight as to why we have to have these kinds of discussions, these workshops. Because to get to the point where everybody voted yes, you can just imagine the negotiations that went on. You can just imagine the back and forth. You can just imagine well, I like this idea. I'm not so sure I like that idea. Can we change this wording? So anyway, you've got a law that's based on a really simple, easy concept. Open government, transparent government. Do your work in the sunlight. But when you try to read it, you're sort of saying, wait a minute. I know it's about transparency and stuff, but my intuition says this and the law seems to say that, and it can be confusing. And one of the reasons we think it can be confusing is that the legislature didn't make some of the things black and white. They're not hard and fast. They left a lot of gray areas in this law, which meant that those of us who are on the front line have to kind of be able to interpret it, sometimes on the fly. Gee, is this a record we're going to give out? Is this an executive session? Did we properly notice the meeting? You get the idea. And to be able to do that, you have to have the tools, Nancy used that word, the tools to be able to make those decisions. And that's why we have these kinds of conversations. Now, as I said, let's try to make it, interactive. I'm talking, you're saying, gee, I don't quite get that, or gee, that's not how we do it here. I wonder if I should just jump in and ask. If you're muted, unmute and ask, and we'll be happy to try to answer the questions as we go along. And folks, I should tell you, I'm not an attorney. This is not a legal dissertation. This is not an order or a command from our commission. I've been doing this for 20 years now. It's hard to believe, but I do this based on what I've seen our commission do. I've based on what I know that our commission has said and ordered. The common sense approach that I've seen other boards, commissions take all around our state. I also, fall back on the fact that I was on a board too. I know when you're a volunteer member on a board, it's sometimes like having a second job. It's sometimes, you do your work during the day and then you run home and you wolf down dinner and then you go to a meeting. I was on one board for 10 years. I was the chairman of that board for the last 5. I was a member of our board of selectmen for 2 years. And now I'm on another board recently appointed. Glutton for punishment, I guess. But you get the idea. I know what it's like to have these things on you now. And like I said, you didn't sign up for freedom of information, but it comes with the territory. Now I happen to be able to know a little bit about it, so I was able to help, the boards that I was on. But some boards, you just, you come into it cold, and you say, what is this FOI stuff? So we'll try to break it down and give you some of the basics so that you're more comfortable at the very least when we leave our session tonight. The law is called freedom of information, but the reality is that it's not really about free information. One of the things I always tell people is, look, it's about access. It's about access to 2 basic things: access to public meetings, access to public records. And in the time we have together, I'll give you a pretty good dose of the meetings provisions and a little bit about the records provisions, just so that you can have a handle on those kinds of things. But when you hear freedom of information, a lot of people get carried away. I don't know if that's ever happened to any of you. They say, gee, freedom of information. Tell me, how did you get to that budget number? Why did you do this? Free information. I have a right to know. And, we answer questions because we're public servants. We answer questions because we know it's the right thing to do as a public servant. But the reality is that the Freedom of Information Act does not require anybody to answer questions. It's an interesting, it's sort of juxtaposition there. You're not required to answer a question. Now we do, because we're public servants, but the law doesn't say that we have to. If people want to dig in and want to get more information, the law says you go to the meeting where the incidents are taking place, where the information is to be gathered, or you read the records where the information is contained. But the thing about answering questions is at some point you may just say, look, I'm not comfortable answering your questions on that. I'm not sure I have the answer. Why don't you go to the meeting and see what the board says? Or why don't you get the records where the information is contained, and that way you know for sure what you're getting. I always tell folks, if that's ever happened to you, if you've ever been bombarded with questions about stuff and people say, under freedom of information, I have a right to know. You think about working at the Freedom of Information Commission. People think that we're the information center for the entire state of Connecticut. They have this vision of us sitting in this giant vault with every record held by every agency. And I get letters every 10 minutes before I got on with you folks. I answered an email from somebody who said, can you tell me, when is the Department of Consumer Protection going to give me my records? And I had to say, no, this is the FOI Commission. We don't have those records. I'm not going to push a button and out the records come. But people think that we're something that we're not. I had a guy call me a couple weeks ago. He says, hi, I need your help. I said, sir, what's the problem? He says, I need a copy of my naturalization papers. Your naturalization papers. I said, isn't that like a federal thing? And he said, yes, it is. But I thought you might have an extra copy lying around, so I thought I'd call you first. It's not what we do. It's not what the FOI Commission is about. Just, by the way, the commission was established as part of this law. And the commission's role is to make sure that people's rights to that access is guaranteed. If people believe they've been denied access to a meeting or denied access to a record, they file a complaint against the public agency with the Freedom of Information Commission. And the commission, first we try to mediate the complaints. We always try to do that, bring the people together. If that fails, then you go to a hearing, and the commission ultimately issues a ruling that says, West Haven, you were correct. That record was properly withheld. Or West Haven, you were wrong. That meeting shouldn't have been an executive session. But our commission issues the final ruling. But to show you how fluid this law can be, commission issues a ruling. If you don't like it, if either party doesn't like it, it can file a complaint with court. So I've seen situations where the FOI commissioner said, this is what we think. Goes to Superior Court, the Superior Court disagrees. It goes back to Appellate Court disagrees with Superior Court. Then it goes to the Supreme Court to make the final decision. The law can be fluid. And even I'd love to say that we batted 1,000, but we don't. Occasionally our commission rulings are overturned, and I'll talk about one of them in a little bit. So, again, be flexible, understand that the law is fluid, but understand that it's about making sure that the people have access, that the people know what's going on in your government, so that when it comes time for them to vote on a budget or to vote in a general election, they know what people stand for, they know what the numbers mean, and they can vote intelligently. Access to meetings and access to records. When we talk about public meetings, I'm going to read you a piece of the definition of public meetings. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. The bottom line, folks, is that when your board gathers to do its work, consider it a meeting. Make sure that it's properly noticed, that it's open to the public, and that there are minutes of that meeting when the meeting is done. All too often people say to me, well, Tom, we had a lot of important stuff to discuss and we didn't feel like it was right to talk about it in public. So can we just sort of have a little pre-meeting meeting and have that discussion? No, it's hard. I realize if you come from the private sector, you're thinking, oh gosh, how do we do this in public? But that's one of the things, that's one of the responsibilities that you have as a public agency. You need to do your work in public. We're going to form a little subcommittee. The subcommittee is not the full board. It doesn't constitute a quorum of the board. So that subcommittee is going to operate outside of freedom of information, right? Wrong. This law applies to all public agencies in Connecticut. And when you read the definition of a public agency, there's a phrase in there that says, including any committee of or created by. So if your 10-member board creates a 3-member subcommittee and says 3-member subcommittee, you are tasked with doing, this job, that subcommittee becomes a separate public agency and needs to follow the same rules. Make sure that the meeting is noticed, make sure that it's open to the public, and make sure that there are minutes when the meeting is done. Yeah, I made reference to the Supreme Court sort of flipping an FOI commission precedent ruling, issued a decision a week or so ago that basically said, if you don't have a quorum, it may not be a meeting. It's that, unless you're tasked with hearing something or doing something, it may not be a meeting. Now, for years, the FOI Commission has said, even absent a quorum, it could be a meeting. Be careful. I think the appellate court and the Supreme Court narrowed that a bit, but it also made it clear that if you are conducting business in any official sense, if you are a de facto subcommittee, whether it's a quorum of the full board or not, you want to make sure you follow freedom of information. So the message is, if we always had some sort of debate over whether 2 or 3 members just sort of happen to meet up at, you meet up at Jimmy's or something like that, and you say, gee, you start having a conversation, is that a meeting? The Supreme Court said pretty much, no, that's not a meeting, unless those 3 members, met or a committee of some kind meeting in secret. But you just want to make sure the extent to you communicate offline, that the purpose of the law is to make sure that you do your work in public. The law gives us 3 different kinds of meetings to work with. It gives us a regular meeting, a special meeting, and an emergency meeting. And the regular meeting is a meeting that you have per schedule that you submit by the end of January of every year. I'm sure most of the boards that you're on or that you deal with have done that. We meet on the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, the 2nd and 4th Wednesday, 7 o'clock town hall, 7 o'clock Board of Ed offices, library, whatever that is. That becomes your regular meeting time. Special meeting is a meeting that you have when you're not scheduled to meet. A lot of times people see that word special and they get very nervous. They say, oh gosh, we can't do this, we can't do, you can do anything you need to do at a special meeting. Here's the difference. For both of them, you need to prepare an agenda. I don't know, are there anybody in the room responsible for agenda preparation? I don't see any hands. Well, if you ever have that responsibility, remember that specificity is important. The law wants the agendas to be specific so that people can look at it and say, okay, I need to go to this meeting, or no, I'm not interested in this. The law says the agenda must fairly apprise the public as to what's going to happen. So you put together your agendas for both the regular and a special meeting. They need to be available at least 24 hours in advance. Now, I'll sort of go off track here for a second because of the mode that we're in now. The governor's executive orders have been extended toward the end of May. And that says that if you are meeting virtually, you need to make sure that not only is the agenda prepared 24 hours in advance and available, it must also be up on your website or your town or city website with a link to the video platform that you're going to use, or I should say the virtual platform that you're going to use. The idea is that people can click on and observe the meeting from afar. You know, without a pandemic, the law said that your meeting is open and anybody can walk in. So this allows for that real-time access that the FOI Act insists on. So you put that agenda up 24 hours ago. So, okay, so far the meetings seem the same. Here's the difference. At a regular meeting, should something arise that's not on the agenda, the board can vote to move things onto the agenda. You've got an item like old business or new business. They're not the greatest agenda items, but at least for a regular meeting, you could put it on there and someone could say, Madam Chairman, I'd like to talk about topic X. It's not on the agenda. I make a motion. Somebody seconds it. If 2/3 of those of you who are present and voting say, yes, that's what we want to do, you can vote to add items to the agenda. At a special meeting, you cannot add anything to the agenda. At a special meeting, you can only talk about what's on that agenda. So if you have an item like old business on the agenda of a special meeting and there's nothing written there, you might as well take it off, because the chairman can't say, is there any old business, because it's not specified on the agenda. Other than that, you can do anything you need to do at a special meeting, again, just so long as it's on the agenda. That's the difference between the two. The third kind of meeting that I made reference to, the emergency meeting, is a meeting that I really strongly discourage boards and commissions from using. Emergency meeting is an unnoticed meeting. And a lot of times people think something's an emergency and it's not, and they get themselves into trouble. My best example of that is, in Connecticut, we have some state holidays that some towns observe, some cities do, some others don't. I'm thinking Martin Luther King's birthday, Veterans Day, Columbus Day, things like that. Inevitably, after one of those holidays, and it's happened every year for my 20 years doing this, the day after, let's say the day after Martin Luther King's birthday, a call comes in, Tom, I've got a problem. What's the problem? Our regular meeting is tonight, Tuesday night. And I always make sure that our agenda is in Monday. I either send it in or bring it in person. And when I went to do that yesterday, I forgot town hall was closed. I forgot that it was a holiday. So I put the agenda in this morning. Is that okay? And the answer is no, it's not okay. It's not 24 hours. Well, Tom, we've got way too much to do. It's an emergency meeting. And my advice there is always, no, it's not an emergency meeting. You want to make sure that you don't think that because you forgot, oops, I forgot, is not an emergency. My recommendation is always to wait 24 hours before you hold that meeting. People say, well, what's the big deal? What could happen? In the interest of time, I won't regale you with the full story, but there's been situations where people have had emergency unnoticed meetings or noticed meetings improperly, and they found themselves in a lot of hot water because they just didn't wait 24 hours. One case involved a situation where a board held an emergency meeting on a Saturday morning, and at that meeting it decided to terminate an employee. The employee was livid for a lot of reasons, but one of them was, what was the emergency? Why couldn't you wait? Notice the meeting. Do it. Well, they felt the employee was going to go off and was going to threaten somebody. Okay, so they have this emergency meeting. They fire him, and then he does. What I explained to you, the process. He filed a complaint against the board with the FOI commission, and the commission thought that the meeting was clearly being held to keep this guy out. So the commission not only ruled that it was a violation, it declared null and void everything that happened at that meeting, which the commission has the right to do. It's one of its strongest powers. It doesn't do it that often, but if it believes the complaint is particularly egregious, it will invoke that power. So it declares null and void what happened at the meeting, which means the guy was fired at a meeting that didn't happen. So, in essence, the town decided it was going to appeal that. The town did not like that decision and appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court. But when it got to the Supreme Court said, you know what? In this case, we agree with the FOI commission. And we also declare null and void what happened at that meeting. Now, if you're at all familiar with the legal process, it's not something that happens, going to the Supreme Court doesn't exactly happen in a couple of weeks. This was 4 or 5 years later. All you budget folks, think about having somebody off the payroll for 5 years and then finding out that he should have been on it for 5 years. It was a mess. It took them several years after the ruling to sort everything out and get back on firm footing again, all because they didn't wait 24 hours. So again, that's an extreme example of something that could happen. But if you're thinking, well, we don't need to notice it, it's not a big deal, we'll just call it an emergency. Just remember, if somebody files one of those complaints, the snowball could start rolling down the hill and really put you in a bad spot. If you ever have an emergency situation, which you might, you never know, you have the meeting, and within 72 hours, you create minutes, and the minutes reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it. People say, can you give us an example of an emergency? The ones I think of, you may know it's a long time, I don't know how long ago, 6, 7 years ago, we had one of those winters where it seemed like we got 3 feet of snow every other day. And, that conjures up bad memories for me. I don't know about you, I'm not a snow fan, but it just kept snowing and snowing. And what happened was municipalities, school districts, started looking up at the roof and seeing the snow pile up and said, you know what, we may have a problem here. And all of a sudden the water starts dripping in, and they said, we really do have a problem here. They couldn't wait 24 hours. They were afraid of a roof collapse or something like that. So they had to meet on the spot, move some money around, and hire professionals to get up there and remove the snow from the roofs so that the roofs wouldn't collapse. That was the sort of thing where 24 hours wasn't going to cut it. They had to take action because they felt, that the water was coming in and they were going to have a problem. That's keeping people safe, keeping people out of harm's way. That's what would constitute an emergency if you ever have that kind of a situation. As I've been saying, your meetings are open to the public. Anybody can come. Again, in pandemic world, that's a little different. You've got to put the link out there, but it does sort of, it puts you out there. If you're an in-person meeting, people at least have to make the effort to show up. People looking for amusement at home. I don't know, guys, has Zoom bombing or WebEx bombing happened to you folks in West Haven, or have you escaped that? Have you heard about it? Do you know what I'm talking about? When this first started, this virtual meeting process first started, I got a flurry of calls from people that said we were sitting there trying to conduct our meeting, and all of a sudden these voices came on, and they were clearly from out of town, probably out of state, and what they were saying was nasty. They were insulting the board members. They were hurling racial epithets, all sorts of nasty stuff. And so people said, well, what should we have done? Well, first of all, you can try to mute them, but if they had sort of overridden, we talked a lot about sort of doing something that runs counter to freedom of information. Now, if you haven't had any, you probably don't need to worry about it, but just sort of file this away. A situation where it got so difficult that they said we have to ask people to get a password to sign in. And that sort of runs against FOI, which says that anybody can show up and you can't make them sign in. But we feel that under the circumstances, if you're under that much duress, that you can probably make that work by not, by giving out that password. I'll share a little Zoom bombing story with you. It certainly wasn't ugly, but I was doing one of these workshops for a group. It was a group of citizen activists up in Enfield. And I'm talking to them like I'm talking to you, and all of a sudden the screen went black. It's very loud music. I want to call it like a merengue music, sort of hot, quick beat music comes on, and I'm looking around. I think maybe it's my daughter and my wife have turned the music on downstairs, and all of a sudden the strippers parade in front of the camera. They're walking over. And when I tell you guys that they didn't leave much to the imagination, oh my. And the people are apoplectic. They're trying to turn it off, and they finally got it turned off. So then I got sort of a flavor as to what a Zoom bombing could be. Anyway, I hope it doesn't happen to you. And just as an aside, the legislature is kicking around 4 or 5 different ideas as to how to sort of codify some of these things that we've been doing since last March, with video meetings and posting things on websites and things like that. So stay tuned. This could be coming to an FOI act near you sometime.
Tom.
Yeah, Nancy.
I just have one thing to say, because it was funny that you bring this up, because I was going to ask you about what's the role going forward with virtual meetings, because I remember a couple of years back, I was at the conference, I was one of the speakers, and it was, what will FOI look like in 20 years? So you're absolutely right. I mean, we got a glimpse in it this past year,
Yes,
but
we did.
do you think there's a chance, like they'll have, obviously they're going to always want public meetings. I understand that. But, again, it has been a way that we've been able to conduct business through the pandemic. And if there's a snowstorm or if somebody's ill or things like that. So do you think there's a chance this time around that they're going to, possibly leave at least some of this or change the law?
I think there's a really good chance. There are 5 or 6 different proposals that are floating around now. Remember that board members could always participate electronically. The difference was that there had to be a central location, and the board members could either be on a screen like this or on the speakerphone. That was the most common use of meeting electronically, but there was always somebody in the room. But as the idea behind doing it this way is that nobody had to be in a room so that we could stay, socially distant, if you will. So I think there's going to be some combination, some, coalescing of different concepts. And I think you'll see the ability to meet virtually if you so choose, or to meet in a room and have both, sort of the hybrid situation. So the board's in the room and whoever wants to be there can be there, and others are virtual. I think there's going to be something that sort of comes out of this legislative session and changes the way. The key will be, I believe, that it'll still be open access, real-time access for people, but I do believe that there'll be some sort of an add-on, a change in the law that allows this kind of meeting. But stay tuned, because I have no idea what form it'll take. And what's interesting to us is, they're debating 5 or 6 different concepts. Well, what happens when the governor's executive order runs out? Then what are we supposed to do? From a freedom of information standpoint, when it runs out, and I think the date is May 20th, and if it's not extended again, any meeting held May 21st goes back to the old way. From an FOI standpoint, we would be powerless because the governor's executive orders are not in our law. So if somebody filed a complaint about it and said, well, they met virtually and they shouldn't have, our hands might be tied. So we hope that they come up with something before the executive orders run out. So another thing to remember, again, this goes a little bit hand in hand with the idea of meeting virtually. Remember that public speaking is not anything that's guaranteed under the Freedom of Information Act. You have the right to attend a meeting, the right to observe a board in action, but the right to speak is not guaranteed by FOI. Whether somebody speaks, if they speak, how long they speak is entirely in the hands of your board. So if you're in a situation where, a topic has been beaten to death and you just say, you know what, we don't want to hear it anymore, you could do that. You could say, we've got too much to do tonight, we're going to limit participation to 2 minutes apiece or 3 minutes apiece. You could do that if you want. You could say, we're not going to hear from the public tonight. Now, all of those things, have nothing to do with Robert's rules. They have nothing to do with your charter or your bylaws. But what I'm telling you is that freedom of information would not say you are in violation if you did any of those things. You have control under FOI as to who speaks and when they speak and how long they speak. But the law does give boards and commissions a couple of avenues, paths to go down to exclude the public. I'm guessing that all of you have heard about executive session. When I say executive session, you know what I'm talking about. Remember, folks, that an executive session is a portion of a publicly noticed open meeting. It's not something that sits out on an island by itself. Sometimes I get calls from people who say, Tom, we've got an executive session. Do we need to notice the meeting? The answer is yes. You still need to convene in public. You need to vote to go into executive session. You need to cite one of the 5 reasons for executive session in your motion, but also in your agenda should have it too, if you know it. Executive session, why, and then all those, and then the vote to go in. By 2/3 of those board members present and voting. In the executive session, you can discuss, you can talk as long as you want, but you must come out to vote. Remember, folks, you should never, ever vote behind closed doors. Always vote in public. Make sure that the votes are recorded and that it's very clear from your minutes who voted for what or for whom. Now, the 5 reasons for executive session: a personnel matter, pending claims or pending litigation, a security matter, a property transaction. You're on a school building committee and you're negotiating with different landowners for the property with which you're going to buy this property and you're going to build a new school. Well, you wouldn't have to have those negotiations in public. The idea would be that you wouldn't want to compromise the town's position by throwing numbers around in public that really could maybe damage your position. Oh, look how much the town is spending. Let's undercut them, or let's bid more than the town is spending so we can get that property. You wouldn't have to have those conversations in public. You could have them privately when a land, a lease, a purchase, sale of town property. The reason number 5 is discussion of a document or documents that you believe are exempt from disclosure. We won't talk a lot about records tonight because most of you, I hope, have staff that give you support in that front. But there are many different exemptions to records, and a board may have its hand on them and want to talk about the content and say, should we be talking about this in public? And you could talk about it privately if the record falls under one of the exemptions. An example, a couple examples. There's an exemption in the FOI Act that says a board or commission can withhold the content of a bid or an RFP if it believes that releasing it would compromise the town's position. It's section 1-210B24. It's a temporal exemption. You can withhold those bids until you've actually signed the contract. But let's suppose you are a board of education and you put your bus contract out to bid, and DATCO bids, and First Services bid, and Durham Transportation bids, and Laidlaw, all these different people bid on your contract. And you want to look at the bids behind closed doors. You want to look at the bid alternates. You want to look at the gasoline pricing, the price for, storage, things. Well, because those bid packages, those documents are exempt, I move we go into executive session to talk about the content of the bid documents, which are exempt from disclosure. You go in, you have your conversation, you look them over, and critical, remember, if you're going to vote, you come out to vote. So you come out of them, you've reviewed them, you feel good about the one. You say, I move that we give the contract to company X. Another example, you are a board that needs a legal opinion from your attorney. You ask your attorney for a written legal opinion, you get that written legal opinion, and you want to talk about that advice behind closed doors. Well, because the document is exempt, you could vote, I move to go into executive session to talk about the written legal opinion that we've received from our attorney. You're the client, you wouldn't have to share it with anybody. You could go into executive session to have that conversation. Those are just a couple of examples of going into executive session for the discussion of records. Now,
Tom, could I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
When you go into executive session, if you're going to invite your town attorney or any other expert or anybody else, does that person's name have to be in the motion that you're inviting them into executive session?
It doesn't necessarily, Mike, have to be in the motion, but it should be in the minutes. It should be in the minutes because by law, the only people who are guaranteed access to an executive session are members of the board. So the minutes should reflect anybody else who's invited in, but it's not required in the motion, at least not under FOI. Some towns may want to do that, but that's not us. Which sort of leads to the next executive session, back to the top, when we talk about an executive session for a personnel matter. When you're preparing the agenda, when you're making the motion, executive session personnel matter doesn't cut it. The law requires more than that. The law requires that you identify the person as much as possible. Now, you don't have to name the individual necessarily. Executive session plan, discussion of the performance of a police officer, discussion of the performance of a public works employee, discussion of the performance of a teacher. You've got to have more than just personnel, but you don't have to name the person. Then you have to make sure that you've noticed the individual, that the individual has been told that he or she is going to be discussed in an executive session. The person then has the right to come forward and say, no, you're not. I do not want that discussion to be held in an executive session. I demand that my performance, my employment be discussed in public. And if the person says that and insists on a public airing of whatever it is you're going to talk about, you cannot go into executive session. That's the person's right. But to Mike's point about who comes into the executive session, a lot of people believe, you know what? You're going to talk about me. I have to be in the executive session. I have a right to be in it. It makes all the sense in the world, but you don't. You have a right to demand that it be done in public, but no right to demand to go in the executive session. You can enter if the board invites you. So the board says, okay, we'll invite you in to have this discussion. Then the minutes reflect, members of the board were there as well as police officer X or public works employee A. That's how that should go. But people think that they have that right to enter, and intuitively that kind of makes sense if you think about it. Hey, they're going to talk about me, I should be in the room. But the law doesn't require that. It's entirely up to you if you invite the person in. The executive session for pending claims and pending litigation, legal matter, is pretty much what it sounds like. Again, with your motion and with your agenda, you want to be more specific than legal matter. You wouldn't necessarily have to divulge any legal strategy in a motion or on an agenda, but you want to give the public some general idea what it is you're talking about, what legal matter it is that you're going to discuss. It also, and it could be a lawsuit, it could be a CHRO complaint, it could be an FOI complaint. You're going in to talk about your strategy, how you're going to handle that. That piece of the law also allows the board to contemplate taking legal action. Let's suppose you're a town and a contractor has, not lived up to what the contract says he or she is supposed to do, and you're going to take legal action. You're going to try to get the bond pulled. Well, you wouldn't have to sort of announce that at a public meeting until, you go into executive session and talk about the strategy, how you're going to do that to protect the town's legal rights. The security executive session is one that never really came up in my first 10 years or so at FOI. But then sadly, since Sandy Hook happened in 2012, it's come up a lot. Comes up a lot with boards of education, but also, other boards, security matter, resource officers at the high school, bulletproof glass at a school building, escape routes, things like that. Stuff that, frankly, we never used to have to worry about, but today we do. Keeping the kids safe, and the idea is the off chance that the wrong people are sitting in the audience. If you want to have that kind of a conversation, you could talk about it behind closed doors to keep some of your security strategy to yourselves. Again, it's important to remember that yes.
Tom, this is Ron Quagliani, City Council Chairman.
Hi, Ron.
Hi, Tom. Just to add on to that point, I would imagine it's any type of security discussion, right? Not just physical security, but it could be a discussion on cybersecurity and network and things like that for the town as well.
Ron, absolutely a good point. I had a situation with a school board, and they got hacked. They got hacked pretty badly, and they wanted to go into executive session to talk about the steps they were going to take. Absolutely, that's where it fell. So, physical security, but cybersecurity, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet. So again, in executive session, discuss, and then come out to take whatever action you're going to take. And again, in the motion, now let's suppose it's something like cybersecurity. You wouldn't have to go chapter and verse as to what you were going to do to prevent the next hack. You could say, Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we move into executive session, that we take the action that we discussed in executive session to protect our infrastructure, and that would be perfectly okay. Any questions about executive session? Sometimes people have questions about executive session. Anything you wanted to ask? Okay, in addition to executive session, the law allows boards and commissions to go down another avenue, another path to exclude the public. And this one's a little funky, but after the definition of meeting in the FOI Act, there's a sentence that begins, meeting does not include. Meeting does not include. And there follows a listing of different things, for lack of a better word, that you and I would call meetings. We would say, gee, that sounds like a meeting. Isn't that a meeting? The legislature said, you may want to call them meetings, but for the purposes of freedom of information, they're not. Meaning that you don't need to notice them, they're not open, and there are no minutes when you're done. So they feel like a meeting, but for the purposes of FOI, they're taken away. Example, collective bargaining. If you're involved in any collective bargaining strategy or negotiating sessions, They're not meetings, even though your whole board may be there negotiating a teacher contract or a public works contract or something like that. Collective bargaining strategy negotiations, not a meeting under freedom of information. Executive level search committees. The Board of Education, the superintendent retires. You form an executive level search committee to look for a new superintendent. That committee can operate outside of freedom of information. The law talks about chance gatherings, and I always chuckle with this one, a chance meeting or a social meeting, neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. If you all go out to dinner together, what else are you going to talk about? I mean, let's be honest. Where do some of the best meetings take place? In the parking lot after the actual meeting happens, right? Let's not be naive. Here's my point, folks. You want to be really careful the extent to which you dig into board business when you're meeting offline, when you're meeting informally, chance meetings, social gatherings. The conversation is going to happen. Let's not be naive. Let's be realistic. But stop it when you start reaching the point where, and you're smart people. Gee, this sounds like something that we should be debating at the council table. This sounds like a council meeting issue that we should talk about in some depth. We need to stop this part of the conversation. Do not set your budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party. Be smart about it. Stop those discussions before they get too deep. What's on the next agenda? Fine. What did you think about what happened at the last meeting? Well, but again, be really smart, be really careful about it, because I guarantee you, the one time you go out to dinner and the debate gets too hot, the wrong person is sitting in the next booth and files a complaint that you had the meeting and took all the action you needed to take offline. And you probably have a difficult situation on your hands if you had done that. Along those lines, when we talk about meetings that are not meetings, but you want to be careful. When you read the definition of a public meeting, it said whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. Electronic equipment is something that's come into play far more today, since last March than it ever had. But how do we communicate? Email, text, telephone, things like that. I'm not telling you to stop talking to each other, to stop sending each other emails, but be cognizant of the fact that if you start debating something via email or via text, that could be a meeting. And what you have to remember too is that when you create an email that has to do with West Haven business, that becomes a public record by definition. And somebody could say, I want to see all the emails between the council members about this topic. And you'd have to produce them. Doesn't matter whether you're on a town server, whether you're working at home, your own tablet, your own phone. If it's done in the process of working for West Haven and your role as a board member or as an employee, it's a public record, and you might have to give it up. Be really careful the extent to which you have those conversations. So the chairman wants to send something out for everybody to see. This is how I feel about this topic. This is what I want to talk about at the next meeting, and I want you all to know what my opinion is. Well, that's okay. That part's okay. The problem comes when somebody else says, well, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. It starts the debate, it starts the discussion via email or text that you should be having at the meeting. So take it, accept it. Okay, this is great. We've got it. We know how he feels. We'll talk about it at the next meeting. Be smart about that. Think in terms, think before you write, and certainly think before you send, because you don't want to be going down the road where you're having a meeting that you shouldn't be having via email or via text or something like that. The other thing, the last thing that we should talk about in the meetings provision is minutes. Do any of you have that lovely responsibility, having to do meeting minutes?
I do.
Okay, I hear somebody. Elizabeth, that's you?
Yeah.
Elizabeth, this is for you then. Minutes need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They are not every word that everybody says. They are not verbatim transcripts. They are not meant to be. They never were meant to be. Technically, the only requirement for minutes is a record of who votes for what or for whom. Now, we want to put more than that in there. We want to have the historical record for West Haven. We want to have more detail. But how much more is really up to you and up to the board. And you want to avoid that lengthy verbatim, first he said, then she said, then they said, because what happens is you get these long minutes that are difficult to read, And inevitably at the next meeting, well, gee, I didn't say that, did I? I didn't mean to say that. Well, if I did say that, I sounded stupid. Can we take that out? And you spend more time on the minutes than you really need to. You want to create that nice, crisp, concise record of what happened, and within 7 days, make those meeting minutes available, and you're fine. And everything should be taken care of.
Tom, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Please.
So the verbatim thing, you're describing my minutes to a T. And I have a problem with that. I need to get better at it because I worry that an abbreviation feels subjective, when in fact it almost feels like I may be doing the opposite. But anyway, my question isn't so much about the minutes. When you were talking about the potential reasons that a meeting might not be subject to FOI.
Right.
Is there any possibility or any time where you could have like a team building, trust building, any kind of exercises that aren't necessarily open to the public, or is that always off the table?
Elizabeth, it is possible, but you want to be careful with those. Now, like something like this, if there's a quorum of any board here tonight, that wouldn't be a meeting. It's a training session. Members of your board go to a PTA meeting to listen. That wouldn't be a meeting. You have a situation, a team building, a trust building, an exercise, a learning session. It could be okay. The one reason I'm hesitating is that some boards talk about having retreats and they want to make them private. But the reality is at the retreat, they're doing business. So if you're going to do that, you want to be really careful that you're not sort of sliding into doing board business. If it's just about, teamwork and things like that. Now, another avenue for something like that, the board wants to talk about its own performance. Now follow me on this. You could notice the meeting and then go into executive session to talk about the performance of the chairman, to talk about the performance of the vice chairman, because board members are public officials and they would also be covered by that personnel executive session that we talked about. So there are ways to do it. You just want to be careful that you haven't sort of stepped over the line and you're conducting business when you shouldn't be. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, good. So are there any other questions about things relating to meetings? Yes, go ahead.
Where would you put like a caucus? Where does that fall in line?
Great question. Those things that I told you that are not a meeting, that seem like a meeting, caucus is one of those. I'm glad you asked that. I'd forgotten that. The caucus, folks, is members of the same board and the same party. So if you've got a 10-member board and you've got 6 Rs and 4 Ds, the 6 Rs can caucus. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, that's a majority of the board. They can sort of set things up. It's a loophole. It's a giant loophole. But if it's only same board, same party, it's a caucus, and they can do whatever they want for as long as they want. The problem that people get into with caucuses is they invite other people in. So you've got a member, the Board of Finance is caucusing 6 members. Let's have the Board of Education chair come join us. Once that happens, it's not a caucus anymore, it's a meeting. So same board, same party, that falls under that sort of umbrella of things that feel like a meeting but then aren't.
Tom, I have a question on it.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Mike.
On the executive search committee, for instance, you gave the example, the Board of Ed, they are going to get together. We have 9 members. They're going to talk about, the hiring of a new superintendent. That executive search committee can be the entire board, correct?
Correct. Now,
Okay.
again, you've got to be careful. The board appoints itself as the executive level search committee. Great. I was on a Board of Education that did just that. Remember, though, that when you're in search mode, well, as long as we're all here, let's talk about some other stuff. Don't do it. You stick with the search mode. All members can be, and there's a case, from the beginning of the FOI Act that addressed that. Absolutely, the entire board can be the search committee. Any other questions about things related to meetings? Okay, in the time we have left, 5 or 6 minutes, let me just talk to you a little bit about public records. Now, the reason that I went heavy on the meetings provisions is because your interaction with the records provisions probably won't be that great. But here's what you need to know. And I mentioned this before when we were talking about emailing between board members. When you create anything, it becomes a public record by definition. So always remember that anything that has to do with West Haven business is a public record. And in theory, somebody could ask to either see it or get a copy of it. Whether you take it in, whether you use it, whether somebody hands it to you. Now, there are multiple exemptions. You know, I mentioned the bids and the RFPs, attorney-client privilege. They may apply. My suggestion is if you get a records request as a board member, that you contact staff, you know, either, I don't, maybe through the mayor's office or whoever sort of helps guide you on that. But when you get a records request, it's important that you remember that any request for records to a public agency must be responded to in 4 business days. Now, respond doesn't mean produce the records necessarily. It means thank you for your records request. We'll look into it. Always acknowledge the request in 4 days. So if it's you doing the acknowledgement or somebody on staff, just make sure you do that, because if you don't, the law says you've denied access and they can file a complaint against you for refusing to give them the records. Then after that, work with the staff, or if it's something simple, if it's an agenda or something, you know, Elizabeth, they ask you for an agenda and they say under FOI, which they don't have to do, but if they do that, just send them the agenda. But if you have to talk to anybody about it, first of all, you can call us, but you can also, you know, talk to staff and sort of ascertain whether or not these records fall under an exemption, whether the records that you actually have. Remember that you never have to create a record that you don't have. A lot of times people will come to public agencies and say, I want a list of this or a report on that, and you don't have it. Your answer is simple. This is not a record that we have. We have nothing that's responsive to your request. You don't have to do research for people. Try to analyze what they're thinking. What do they mean? What do they want? When do they, you know, you don't have to do that. Freedom of information is a request for a record that exists. You then look at the record and determine whether or not, remember, most records do get released, but you want to check every request. Does this fall under any of the exemptions? If not, if you're not sure, you ask. If it doesn't fall under one of the exemptions, give it out. I spend a lot of time on the phone answering questions from departments all over the state, from police departments to fire departments to an ambulance corps to town halls to city clerks to town clerks. It's not always crystal clear. And we sometimes have conversations, and sometimes I say, well, you know, it seems to me that that's one you could withhold, but if they file a complaint, you might want to come back to me. We could talk about it again. So it's important that you get help, that, you know, if you get a records request for something that you're not clear about, that you ask questions. Again, we're there to help. You now have a face to put with a voice. I don't want to, you know, embarrass her, but Mayor Rossi is very good with freedom of information, so I suspect her office is well versed. She can help you, and just know that the key to it is remembering that you don't want to get possessive. You don't want to say, oh, they're mine, you can't have them, or they're police records, or they're council records, or they're Board of Ed records. They're public records. The definition is broad. It covers all records, and you just want to make sure that you're aware of that as you go forward. You know, I'm trying to think of some of the most common questions that are asked. Are my notes public records? Well, technically they're public records, but they're most likely exempt. Unless they become part of a permanent file, they're your personal notes, you probably wouldn't have to release them. There are exemptions for things that are in police records that if released would somehow compromise an investigation. Records that might have trade secrets in them can be withheld. Records that if released would be a security risk can be withheld. I'm just going through some of them in my head. There's an exemption for things that are in personnel files. A lot of people think, oh, it's a personnel file, nobody's going to see it. Surprise, personnel files are public records too. There is an exemption that says if releasing it would be an invasion of somebody's privacy, you can withhold it, but there's a whole process for that. And if you ever get one of those, you know, come see us or see somebody in City Hall, and we'll help you walk through the steps to look at whether or not it's an invasion of privacy. I like to share this one story with people just to sort of give them an idea. I took a call a couple weeks ago now from a woman. She says, hi, my name is Sean, I said, hi, Sean, how are you? She said, good. She said, I'm calling you from Georgia. Sean from Georgia. Why is she calling me? She says, well, my husband is an out-of-state contractor, and he did a job in Connecticut last summer. And I think he had an affair with a state worker. Why is she calling me? It wasn't me, right? Well, she's calling because she wants to know under Freedom of Information if she can get cell phone records, if she can get emails, if she can get, things like that. And I said, well, if there's an email that says, meet me at the construction trailer at 6:00, we'll review the project blueprints and then ... That's a public record. She said, good, it'll help me with my divorce. Think before you send. Think, because anything could be a public record. If you don't want to see it in the front page of the register, just think about it. It's really important that you do that. On that note, are there any questions about anything that I haven't touched on that
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for this tonight.
You're welcome.
It was all very helpful, including starting with your history lesson on El Grasso. I did not know that, so that was pretty cool.
Good.
Is there any kind of FOI Bible or handbook or cheat sheet the way Robert's Rules has a little, I'm just wondering if there's something I could tangibly have.
It's not quite as condensed. There's a couple things, and I don't know if the mayor has any of them. We have these little highlight cards. One of the things that you lose by not having, I bring them as parting gifts when I come to do these.
I have those. I've given them to some of the boards and commissions, the little one, the trifold.
Right.
But that's the only cheat sheet that I do.
That's a little cheat sheet. But if you go on our website, we have a couple of things on there that might be helpful. We have a PowerPoint presentation that we give at our annual conference, if we're ever able to do one again. We've had to cancel it 2 years in a row. But it's a PowerPoint that's sort of step-by-step FOI 101. And there's also on there, if you click on there and say frequently asked questions, and you click on that, trying to read the whole act, I find, is a little cumbersome. So there's frequently asked questions, highlights, things like that you might be able to use to help you in that regard.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Anything
Tom,
I may have missed? Yes.
one other question for me is
Yes.
draft documents.
Yes.
Where do draft documents fit in FOI, whether it be a draft budget or draft testimony or something like that?
The draft exemption, to be completely honest, is one that's all over the place, but there is an exemption for drafts. And my recommendation on that is that if it is truly something that is subject to disclosure, that hasn't been shared with anybody, I said disclosure, subject to revision is what I meant to say, that hasn't been shared with anybody, you can invoke the draft exemption. Now, budget time is tricky because the first draft proposal usually is shared with the whole board, and the departments share their original proposals, their requests. But so draft budgets probably aren't a good example. But if you're working on a document and it's subject to revision and you're going to go over it and it's not done yet, you would be allowed to withhold that under the draft exemption.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
There's only one other thing I want to add, and that is that Tom Hennick, if you call him, because there's no matter how much, even with myself, I find things that I'm not sure. So I'd rather call the expert. And so he will share his telephone number, and he does get back to you. So it's important because you're going to leave here and you were given a lot of information. It's just going to take a little while to process it and understand it all. And 6 months from now, you may be presented with a situation that wasn't covered here, or maybe you forgot or whatever. Feel free. I mean, if I'm not available or I can't answer it, feel free, right? I don't want to speak for your time, Hennick, but
no, that's actually my closing line. You now have a face to put with the voice on the other end. And by the way, I mentioned that I'm not an attorney. I may not know all the answers, but I will get you one. And remember that when you ask a question and we answer it, it doesn't mean that it's an order. You could say, okay, that's what they think. Now what are we going to do? At least you would have a foundation. You'd have a base upon which to make your decision. So that's how you would but always call, send an email or call. We're always happy to try to help. We would rather help you sort of sidestep, avoid a problem than be in the middle of a problem and then have to try to work out of it. So, always never hesitate to pick up the phone and call. And this working remotely, today was a half home day and a half Hartford day. Tomorrow's a Hartford day. Monday's a home day. You just call the office, leave a message if I'm not there, and I will return the calls immediately. Is there anything else? Are there any other questions? Any other thoughts? Seeing none. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend, everybody. Good holiday. And maybe we'll see you down the road. Maybe we'll get to do it live sometime. How about that?
And thank you. Thank you
You're
very,
welcome.
very much.
All right,
Thank
guys.
you,
Good night.
Night.
Thanks, Tom.
Participant has left the meeting.
You.